I think that the Cincinnati Bengals should still trade him away. It would free up $26 million in cap space. Now, Joe Burrow has tried to make it pretty clear that he wants to keep the band together. He wants to turn this Bengals team, the current version of it, into a Super Bowl champion winning team. I don't think that you can do that tying yourself down to two massive receiver contracts. We saw how awful their defense was this past year. It was awful. You already have Jamar Chase. You already have one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. You don't need to get greedy here by thinking that you need as many high-priced weapons as possible. You got to find somebody in this year's draft. You have to trade away Tee Higgins. You need to accumulate capital. Being tied down to that much receiver money is going to kill them.
I think it's a total mistake by Cincinnati from 2 years ago not to pay this guy. If you're seeing a guy like Tee Higgins and you're questioning whether or not he's worth the contract, just pay him. Because 2 years later, he's going to be way more expensive. And next year, they're going to be sitting with this same exact issue. What do I do with Tee Higgins? I just tagged them again. How is this possible that we see these teams do this with players? We saw Washington do it with Kirk. And by the time they were ready to sign Kirk, the quarterback market had skyrocketed tens of millions higher than it was 2 years ago when they originally could have signed him. Same thing's going to happen with T. Same thing's going to happen when Jamar Chase gets paid.
Okay.
So they're late to the party because they're so cheap. They need to keep Tee Higgins because Burrow is so much better when he has Tee Higgins on the roster. And if it's just going to be, this is what we invest in our triplets, is Burrow, Chase, T, and we're just going to keep on having a rookie running back, so Sidney Brown, late draft pick, come on in, be our bell cow, that's their direction. But they actually have to lock it in and not keep on toiling with a flex 1-2 wide receiver in Tee Higgins, who would be a one on a lot of teams.
I just can't
They're so cheap.
Okay, but forget that. This isn't Kirk Cousins. It's not a quarterback. It is a receiver. And this, we're not even talking about their number one receiver. We're not talking about like, hey, yeah, what do they do with Jamar Chase? This is the second guy. This is a guy that we don't even know how he would play if he didn't have Jamar Chase opposite of him. He's still a great receiver. I'm not trying to knock him that much. But when you have so many other needs and you have so much money committed to Joe Burrow and you're about to unload a shitload of money to pay Jamar Chase, you have to look at the rest of the needs of the roster. It is far better, far, far better to have roster balance instead of elite players at a couple of positions. The Rams, LA Rams, I think are a good example of that, where they have been consistently good because they have drafted well. Did they pay a couple of guys a lot of money here and there? Sure. They paid Jalen Ramsey a ton of money. They paid Aaron Donald a ton of money. They paid Matthew Stafford a ton of money on that run when they won a Super Bowl. But for the most part, they're getting good production out of mid-level starters and free agents that they moved around to go and get. I think that for how cheap, and there's no avoiding the cheapness here, because the ownership for the Bengals is one of the poorest, which is insane to say. It's one of the poorest out of any of the other owners, because this is a guy who, I think I forget his first name, but it's Paul Brown's son.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
The ownership comes from
Mike Brown.
The ownership comes from owning the team. This is not like the other situations where it's billionaire business leader, owner of Walmart, who's paying for everything. You don't have that money to dip into. So when you're already dealing with that hurdle, you need to take advantage of the fact that Tee Higgins is coming off of a pretty good year and a ton of production that you could, in a bad receiver draft, you could probably move him for at the bare minimum an early second. The Patriots pick, I bet the Patriots would be so damn happy if you traded him and to send their second round pick for him.
It's not worth it for the Bengals. They don't draft well. I think they tried to replace Tee Higgins a couple years ago with Jermaine Burton. He's been
1 year ago.
1 year. Yeah, they try to do that. Not going to work. They're going to try to do it again in this draft. Let's see if we can find a wide receiver, step up, take Tee Higgins' spot, and then we move on for him. But a second round pick for Tee Higgins' production, they haven't shown outside of literally Jamar Chase and Tee Higgins that they're good at this, that they're good at finding a guy to come in and replace. We get a guy, we can't pay him, so be it. We know that we're confident enough to find another guy like the Rams. I'm sure they were looking down the barrel a couple years ago. Cooper Kupp starting to get a little old. What do we want to do? Let's find a guy. Who would we find? Puka Nacua, another number one. The Bengals aren't going to do that this year. They're not capable of doing that. They haven't shown me that they can do it. So the only way to keep their window open is to keep Burrow, Chase, and Higgins as long as possible.
Okay, but why hamstring yourself though? Like, okay, one, it's kind of a defeatist attitude.
That's
just to
all
be
they
like,
got.
hey, we can't draft, so we just need to give up. We're not gonna bother drafting. We're not gonna even try. We're not even gonna attempt to take a swing at drafting a replacement. The other part about this is like, just because you've had poor drafts previously, why hamstring yourself for the future? Why hamstring yourself to not take advantage of the fact that he is worth a lot, that he's going to be worth good draft capital, and that you would have more money to spend elsewhere in free agency? Why wouldn't you take advantage of that?
Because they don't have enough. They have to do what they can do to stay in it, because they have an MVP caliber quarterback. They have an all-pro wideout and a very good wideout in Tee Higgins. Outside of that, how did they not do better this past year? It's bad coaching, and it's bad drafting through and out. They had the sack leader and an MVP candidate, and they couldn't do anything.
They were bad because there's no balance. There's no balance on the roster. So, okay, let me ask you this.
Everyone gets 7 picks every year, Joe.
But you're not going to find starters with all 7 picks. And the way you increase that chance is by getting more early picks. What is the solution here to find better defensive linemen? They just got rid of Alex Kappa. Like, what are we doing here to fix this?
Jermaine Pratt's searching for a trade. Yeah, they have to keep Tee Higgins if they want to stay afloat. This is what they had to do. They should have paid Tee Higgins 2 years ago. They didn't. So tagging Tee Higgins is how they stay afloat and stay relevant and don't take their entire season, because you're right. Their roster is full of holes. They are decrepit in the linebacker position, the defensive backfield. Not great. But the only way you keep winning is if you keep Tee Higgins, at least for this year.
But I don't agree. We have seen plenty of times in the past where you've got the high-priced player on your roster that's maybe a little bit dissatisfied, you can't figure it out, where you trade the guy away and then you go on and have success. We're not talking about a quarterback here.
The Bucs didn't trade away Chris Godwin, and I think that's been having 2 good wide receivers has significantly aided Baker Mayfield's late-stage career development in having a Mike Evans and a Chris Godwin.
Well, but they're not getting over the hump. They're basically in that same.
They're making the playoffs every year. They were good. They were better last year than this year.
Mediocre last year.
This year they were very mediocre. Last year they were better.
I would argue the lack of defensive consistency is what hurt them and why they couldn't have finished the season stronger and why they couldn't have beaten the Commanders in the playoffs. So you just named the NFC version of the Bengals. You just named the same.
Bucs.
The Bucs are the NFC.
Bucs are in a better spot than the Bengals. They have been.
I disagree on that, but they're basically the same situation.
The Bengals
one's playing in a much easier division.
The Bengals also have one of the weirdest patterns in all of football that nobody else seems to do, where in September they just lose games. Early season, they're never awake. 0-3 to start the year this year.
It's a Zach Taylor bit.
They were 1-4 to start the year going into October. How do you do that in the NFL? Like it's a Zach Taylor issue, and then
I think it's a Joe Burrow issue too, because I feel like Joe Burrow doesn't like. Basically, what felt like happened this year is that Joe Burrow realized he had to do everything so that they were going bonkers on offense, and that suddenly inspired and sparked them to have ridiculous production. That was basically what happened. That is the biggest hurdle, first and foremost, but the way that you take that extra step forward is by improving your defense and spending a little bit of money on some quality veterans and drafting early on the defensive side of the football. It's the only way we fix this thing.
Well, they made a lot of bad defensive decisions. They let Jesse Bates walk. They shouldn't have let him walk. I love Jesse Bates as much as I've ever loved
But I'd rather freaking keep Jesse Bates than
who'd they replace him with?
Higgins. But I would have rather tried to do everything possible to. This is what happens when you get yourself into cap hell for paying too many guys big contracts.
Keep them both. Their best defensive player, their best young defensive player is their nickel corner.
Keep them both, brother. There's a salary cap.
The Rams find a way to get by.
They've got one of the highest paid quarterbacks.
Them picks won a Super Bowl and then showed their drafting competence. Every year since they've shown that they can draft. They pulled Christian Roseboom out of the FCS, and he's played for them for 7 years. Did anybody have Roseboom on their big board? No.
Well, I mean, they
draft well. They know their priorities.
Roseboom's also not that great of a starter. He just does enough.
He started for 6 years for him.
Because they've been deliberate about not overpaying for other positions and having premier starters in other spots. There's a reason why they get rid of Cooper Kupp.
I got you.
Because they know, like, hey, man, we can't pay Puka and Cooper. We gotta prioritize here.
Bit of a tongue twister there.
So whatever you do, don't show Sean Anderson a salary cap table. Whatever you do,
I'm sure. Don't show me the big board for the Bengals. I'll carve it up and scrap it and say start from scratch. Actually, hire an outside firm. You know what? Just bring in Nagy. Snag Nagy from college ball and say, you're doing this for us. We can't do it.
I don't think his drafting prowess is as good as you think it is.
It's better than the Bengals already.
Okay.
They lucked into Joe Burrow and they lucked into
if the
Jamar
Bengals
Chase.
could just send invites to everybody that they want to come play for them, maybe that would make things
This team
easier for them. Okay.
is a disaster.